Hello, I'm Jackie Barry, author of Experiential Speaking, and I'm here today with Jon Baker. He's written a book, Running Meetings That Make Things Happen, and he is famously a speaker and trainer to do with introverts in business. Hello, Jon.
Hi, Jackie. It's great to be here.
What I've been all about is audience participation in the room with that first book, and I'm currently working on a new one about online engagement because most of us have been presenting using Zoom and similar technology for a long while and are likely to carry on for a bit more. When it comes to attracting introverts to your event in the first place, how do you invite them? How do you get people labelled introverts to even want to attend?
I think the first thing is that introverts aren't strange people. They haven't got three heads. They don't come from Mars. And so does your event fit with what they need? Have you made clear what your event will deliver? And of course, more and more nowadays, emotional appeals come in through marketing. And yeah, all people, marketing hasn't been invented because it doesn't work. It's there because it does work. So the normal emotional needs, the normal emotional appeals, I think are really important. But over the top claims and getting really, really over the top about it is, I think, from the discussions I've had with people, is less likely to work. But then, of course, you added that extra layer about being interactive. So I want to quickly pick up on that one. I think the first thing for me is, do I like being on webinars, presentations, whatever, where they are interactive? Yeah, absolutely. If I sit through a 3/4 of an hour listening to somebody, just like anyone else, if there's no interaction, I will find it harder to concentrate. So I think it's really important to sit there and say, why do we want to be interactive? We want to be interactive to improve the concentration span. We want to be interactive so we can deliver our points. What we don't want to be interactive for is just for the sheer hell of being interactive. And I think that's a really important one to put. Or as I've put it before now, many speakers concentrate on engagement, and I think that's really important. But activity is only a proxy for engagement. Engagement is what happens in here. So we've got to remember why we're trying to be interactive.
Oh, that's a really good and subtle distinction. Thank you. Engagement's what they get, and activity is what you, the presenter, facilitate. But what I'm curious about is in this pre-event marketing, if something's labelled as interactive and fun, do you think that might put off, judging by your reaction, would that put off introverts like you if something's marketed as being fun?
When I see the word interactive and fun, I'll be honest and say I often shudder. And I just did now, just involuntarily. The reality is that normally this only means you've got polls and questions there. And so there is nothing wrong with that. What I shudder at the thought of is some of the things, very few of them, where people are all expected to start dancing around and all sorts of things, which I do generally. If it was a dance class, then it makes a lot of sense. But if all we're doing is jumping up and down for the sheer hell of it, just to prove to the presenter that the presenter has got everybody engaged, in inverted commas, then no, that doesn't appeal to me at all. And that's what I shudder at. And in the interviews I've done with many other introverts, they're very, very similar in that respect. So I think interactive, first of all, is a slightly scary word because I've seen the worst of it, but I also know that the vast majority of interactive webinars, interactive workshops only mean using polls, only mean using questions and sensible discussion. So first of all, that says to me, perhaps what we need to do is explain what interactive means. Rather than using the word interactive and fun, perhaps it's about your questions answered live, or you can join in, or so it's actually clear what that interaction is. And I think that would work far better.
That's a good point. In any kind of copywriting and marketing, being specific is better than being vague and general. I'm going to come back to worst experiences later on. But first, let's say something else about introverts and extroverts. I know there's a common misconception about the definitions, but one of the distinctions is that extroverts get energy from being with people when introverts get energy from being alone. And so what is different about the energy drain on an introvert when they are in the physical space with people and when they're online with people?
I think it's fairly similar, to be honest. I think when we're in the room, shall we put it like that, you've got all the, as you said, there's the people interaction, and many introverts will feel drained from doing that. When you're online, you've, again, general responses that I've had say it's still tiring, and a couple of reasons why that might be more so than face to face. First of all, introverts tend to be very good listeners, as a result of which they tend to be looking for all of the non-verbal cues. And of course, if I'm just looking at a little matchbox on the screen, I'm having to work harder to do that. So it can be more tiring just because of the focus. And that's, of course, before the very fact that I've seen lots of research, and I'm sure you have too, Jackie, about the general population having to concentrate really hard on that camera so that they can be seen, and people moaning if you look to one side or something, or you look down, no, you must be looking at the camera all the time. That's incredibly tiring in its own right. So I think online is tiring, full stop, and more so than most people think. Online is still draining from an introvert point of view. It's also more tiring because I think we're amping up the other parts of our listening skills. I think the different pieces, it's a bit more controllable. So you know what, if I really wanted to, I can just do that really subtly there, or I could, and that's without even having to hit the volume button. And suddenly I can't hear anything. Great, I've got a moment. It's still interaction. I'm still kind of going to drain a bit, but it is more controllable. It was really interesting. I was having a chat with a guy that runs a networking organization across the UK, and we were talking about networking, introverts, online networking, offline networking. And as he said, he's had a lot of discussions with people, and during his online stuff, he found that the introverts were more likely to remain online, whereas many of the extroverts were the ones that said, I don't like all this online networking stuff. I just want to get back to face, because in the case of many of the extroverts, of course, what they're missing is holding court, standing there and proclaiming loudly and having everyone clustering around them. Whereas many of the introverts don't particularly enjoy that in the online and the offline situation in the first place.
Now, you've been presenting online, I guess, for at least the last year and a bit.
Yep.
Do you use audience participation in your sessions that go beyond polls and Q&A?
As presenters, as trainers, as anyone that's even just running a meeting, we need to have a way of increasing the engagement periodically. So make sure people are concentrating, changing something. And polls are an incredibly good way of doing that if they're properly done. And some polls, I've seen some polls which are just kind of blah, blah, and they're almost there just for the sheer hell of having a poll. Oh yeah, I must have a poll because Jackie told me to do a poll every 7.3 minutes. Here's a rubbish poll. That doesn't work, but polls can be really good. Questions, turning around to the audience online and saying any questions, of course, won't always work. And we've all suffered that, I guess, when we've sat there and said questions and we go, oh, nobody's asking a question. Other things, but again, interaction, yes, I think they're incredibly important. Other things that I find useful online are things like Mentimeter. And one of the reasons I particularly like that one is because everybody can join in, and I've done it occasionally where I've been running a hybrid thing. So you've got some people in the room who can go on Mentimeter, some people in the Zoom who can go on Mentimeters. But the next thing about it is, because when I tend to do the word clouds. And so I'll ask a question, people will put in 3 or 4 of their favorite words that apply to whatever I've said. It allows the audience immediately to see what's going on. The scale of the words represents how common that word is. But more to the point, it allows us to start digging in. As a presenter, I can then sit there and pick out 2 or 3 of the important words, and we can talk about that. I could then, if you've got some big words, I can then ask general audience so I can, rather than just throwing out a question, which often stumps people, we can talk about what's on the Mentimeter screen, and then it can lead into questions. So rather than just, as I say, I think interaction is important, but I think the way of doing it is possibly more important. But do I get people to stand up and jump up and down and all sorts? No.
No, me neither. And I just want to reinforce the point you've made a couple of times, that all the activities have to have a point. There isn't it isn't just for fun and injecting energy, it has to help with the learning outcome. I'm a big fan of Mentimeter as well, not least because it takes people away from the one Zoom screen to a different device or a different window, and that also helps them re-engage their concentration. Other ways of getting introverts involved in things they might otherwise be reluctant to do.
I often think with questions, one of the almost defining points I talk about introversion is, as you rightly picked up, there's the energy thing. But the other thing is that most introverts are internal processors. So that means we tend to think to talk. So ask a question, and in my head, I'm immediately whirring around what's the best, the most structured, the most complete answer I can possibly give. And then the great thing about that is that I'll come out with I might not, but most intelligent introverts will come out with a structured answer, as opposed to an extrovert who talks to think. Boom, the words fly back out, and that's how they're making sense of them, by talking. Now that's sounds all very good, but there's a couple of important ramifications. Firstly, is that introverts will tend to leave a gap. And if you jump into that gap and fill it because you're an extrovert and you've been trained, don't like gaps, what you're really saying to the introvert is, I asked you a question and I'm not interested in your answer. Here's what I want you to talk about instead. In fact, I'm just going to carry on talking. And so the first thing is, if you are going to engage introverts, do remember that you need to leave that pause there, because otherwise you've just turned me right off. If I'm sitting there seriously going through, right, what is it I want to say? Because it's a great question. Allow me the decency to answer. Now, there's ways of arranging that so you can do it. So I might pose a question that's a general one, and I might get somebody I know to be extroverted to answer it first, because that way I'm allowing the introverts in the room a bit more of a gap to think about it. So that's point number one. I might at the same time say, that's a great answer. I'm going to come back to a couple more in a moment. So again, flagging it up, saying to them, I'm going to come back, and then perhaps ask another extroverted person. Similar things, you can sit there and you can say, right, in a moment, I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to pick out some people to answer it. Again, you're giving the chance to answer. And another one is, and this works online and offline, in a meeting, I'll sit there and say, I'm going to ask everybody to answer this, but for no more than 20 seconds. So what we've now done is, one of the introvert hates is these people that just talk and talk and talk and talk. We just put them into a little box. We've said 30 seconds. So as a facilitator, I make that request. I've got to hold them to it. That brilliant, thank you. And by picking on a couple of the more talkative ones first, and telling the introverts on the call that I'm going to get round to them, they've had processing time and they know they've got to answer it. So again, it's about the way you structure the questioning rather than just, is there something different that you can do?
Really great advice there. And just to recap that distinction about the introverts think to talk while the extroverts talk to think. And therefore, as a presenter, you need to allow the pauses and set it up in such a way that the introverts can get as involved as everybody else. One technique I heard that is the 1, 2, 4, all technique, where if you're asking a group to think about something, first you give them a couple of minutes to think about it on their own. Then you put them in pairs, perhaps in breakout rooms, so they can discuss it and come up with the best solution between the two. Then you put the pairs in groups of 4 and they can talk about what, and then they all come back into the main group and they can share as a big group. But this is a way of introverts getting more comfortable with the process. You threw them into the big group straight away, they're less likely to be able to contribute in a way that feels safe for them.
I think that's a really good point, because what tends to happen is, if you just throw that big question out there and pick on, in inverted commas, somebody that doesn't want to answer immediately, perhaps they're subconsciously embarrassed about that little gap before they answer, and many are, then you can put them off. If you put them into a small group first where they're much more able to talk, brilliant. If whatever you do, when you get them engaged a little bit, they're going to carry on, much more likely to continue being engaged. Do you remember those days when we'd stand on a stage and talk to people? I would put a piece of card underneath everybody's chair. And rather than getting them to put their hands up and shout things out, on the card, I'd get a couple of words and then I'd collect them and then use that as well. It's just different ways. It's like the Mentimeter word cloud, but done in a really old-fashioned way. But as you start to get people hooked in, it's the same as, again, in meetings, and this, you can do this virtually and online. In a meeting, you can get, right, what I don't want anybody to speak for the next 30 seconds. I want you to all write down your answer. Now, where you go with that written answer depends on what you want to do. The classic, of course, for a trainer is you wrote it down on a Post-it note and everyone goes to stick it on the wall. But what's happened? You've all got engaged and you're all seeing how everybody else is without having to listen to one person and worry about your answer. Once you're engaged, you're more likely to continue being engaged. On a Zoom meeting, you might get everybody to write it down and then you work around the room and get everybody to read out what they've written.
And online, there are tools such as Padlet, where you can have a virtual corkboard with Post-it notes that are digital for people to write on, and everyone sees all the responses at the same time. In the room, I have a parallel experience to you and your card, where I would sometimes get people to write questions on paper, screw it up and throw it to me in front of the room, and then I can pick a question at random and no one's embarrassed them because they don't know who asked it. And as the speaker, I also had control of which questions I read out and which ones I dealt with without the risk of being taken off track by an audience member asking a question that was on a tangent.
Love it, yeah.
How do you then, as a presenter, tell who in your online audience is the introvert and who's the extrovert?
The biggest one I often find is useful is that, and especially if you've had a chance to talk to the audience beforehand, is that little gap there. It's that internal processing gap. If it was face-to-face meeting and you're chatting to people, they're quite likely to be the ones that are hanging around the edges of the room. So again, that's quite likely to be going on. They might be the ones that are, they're aware that they don't really want to engage in people. So sorry, I'm doing something incredibly important on my phone. No, I'm not, by the way, but it is one of the greatest pieces of defense mechanisms in the world. It's suddenly I'm important and busy. So there's little signs like that are probably the quickest ones to pick up as a presenter. I mean, of course, we could go on for quite a lot longer, but there are other signs that, they're the quick ones you can pick up from the front of the room.
Having identified who might be an introvert in your online meeting, are there any other techniques for engaging them and inviting them in?
The first thing is, this isn't about managing people differently because they're introverts. It's not about going, I've got to do something completely different. It's about doing what we would do if we want to engage everyone in our audience. It's about just thinking through it. It's not about, right, I must do this because so-and-so is an introvert. So I think it's general rules, but being aware. So the first thing is be aware of who might be quieter, who might not be. Secondly, the way we structure the questions, exactly as we said earlier. So I might throw the question out there. I might set it up for a few minutes earlier so people have got the chance to think through it. I might then, if I definitely want that quieter person to answer because I happen to know they've got a really important view on them, I might ask a louder person first, so they've got the thinking time. And then I might say, and Jackie, I know that you've got some great expertise on this. So not only have I given you a chance to think about it, I've then named you. And by talking for another few seconds, I've given you an extra piece of padding time, as well as building you up in the first place.
You're right. Everybody is somewhere on this scale, aren't they? It's a case of your rights and responsibilities as a presenter to involve them all without actually discriminating in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, it's a bit like the question I was asked a couple of days ago: does it take longer to manage an introvert? So it was a leadership type of question, because they were aware of some of the types of things. Well, if you want to engage them and all the rest of it. I said, no, you don't manage them differently. You manage everybody differently, and that's the point.
Yes, we're all different. We all have our own preferred ways of doing things. Yeah. Let's move to the other side of the divide then. You've also been a participant, I'm sure, in online events.
Yep.
And a noted introvert. What experiences have you particularly hated, and which ones have you loved? What's worked for you?
It always seems to happen on poor quality audio, but being picked out at random and asked to respond. and talked at while thinking, because that's the other thing. So if you imagine, Jackie, you just asked me a question, which I'm not expecting. The audio quality is poor in the first place. I'm picked at random and right, want to know really, really quickly. And I keep talking at you while you're trying to think. It's like, whoa, hang on. So that's probably the worst piece of online engagement or disengagement that I've ever had. Yeah.
And what about the best? Have you been at meetings where something's happened and you've felt really involved and engaged?
First of all, there was a great piece of setup by the presenter, so that there was some stuff that was easy to understand. There was some detail, because introverts tend to like going down into some detail. So there was some easy to understand bit from the presenter. There was some detail from the presenter. There was a setup question, so that we already knew what was going to be talked about. And then again, it was done via, it wasn't Mentimeter. There was some of the very similar tool whereby everybody could put some words onto the screen, and then and the presenter then picked into those words, by which time you kind of, everyone dying to start talking about what they've said, whether they're introverted or extroverts. So I think this setup is so important, but without just kind of making everybody answer right now, go.
Is there anything else that you would advise?
One of the other things that most introverts tend not to like is egotistical people. And immediately that's just going, oh, no, hang on. And I'm starting to shut down. When I get one or two of those, it's like, I've gone. So I think this time I'm focusing almost on that, not on how to engage the introvert, but how not to disengage them, and allowing that kind of ego willy waving stuff to go on is going to just disengage people.
You're the expert about introverts in business. Where can people go to find out more?
Well, this is going to be a real shock to you, Jackie. You just said I'm the expert in introverts in business, and the website is called introvertinbusiness.co.uk.
Fantastic. That is so interesting. And it is a reminder that anyone who presents shouldn't assume that the people in their audience are the same. Just respecting all our differences and being adaptable and flexible is the answer to successfully delivering almost any kind of training content.